Well, hello everyone. As it says on the board, and this might kindly introduce me, I'm David Tyfield. I'm a reader in LEC, in Environmental Sociology and Innovation, and I've been living, I'm no longer living, but I have been living in Guangzhou for the last 2 years, setting up a joint institute between LEC and partners in South China. So the perspective I'm going to give on this very ambitious question of how will China shape the future, I'm going to tell you how it is. No, I'm not. I'm going to give you a suggestion of how to respond to this extraordinarily big question from the perspective of two very important issues, which are the environment and innovation, and how these two come together. So the first, of course, issue about environment and how China will shape the world is that China's environmental challenges are immense, and they are also not just China's. They are, in the sense, everybody's. For instance, if we take the fact that 60% of the Chinese energy grid is powered by coal, however clean that coal can become, it is still the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So climate change, of course, is an enormous issue. China is, of course, now absolutely, as a country, the biggest emitter. But also, because of the extraordinary rapid growth that Wei was talking about, per capita figures have also rocketed and have overtaken Europe, for instance, which is, I think, quite startling. But it's not just climate change. Other issues: pollution, air, soil, water, food safety. Food safety is an extremely combustible social issue in China. Also questions of desertification, salinization, and simple land loss. A statistic you may have heard many times is that China has almost 20% of the world's population, but only 8% of the world's arable land. So the question, who will feed China, which was put by Lester Brown in 1995, has been answered to date as China. China will feed China. But with those kinds of land pressures, it's a question whether or not that can continue. And of course, within all of this is the unprecedented urbanization, an extraordinary historical change, which is still ongoing, although at an extraordinary set momentum, I think. So up to another 350 million people will be moving to a city in China in the next 10, 15 years. And I think it's always worth to a Western audience to just think about the size of those figures. You know, we are concerned about accepting 2,000 Syrian refugees into Britain, and yet 350 million people will be moving from the Chinese countryside to Chinese cities. A particular issue that I'm interested in, which I'll talk about shortly, is, for instance, the growth of the car. So by 2010, there were a total of 40 million cars on Chinese roads. Now it is growing at an extraordinary 22 million per year. So clearly the biggest car market in the world, and there has been barely a dent in the growth of the car market, even through the global financial crisis and the subsequent downturn. What all this adds up to, though, and what is exceptional about China, is not just the extent of these environmental problems, but that when you put them together with an authoritarian one-party state, it adds up to problems which are existential regime challenges. In other words, the environment is not just a big problem, it is a political problem, and it is taken as one by the government. So this adds up to an extraordinary regime-enabled momentum in trying to deal with these problems. What I mean by that is that in the UK, if there is a problem with the environment, if there are floods, the worst that can happen, we fear, is, or that the government fears, is that they lose the next election. It isn't that the whole system could collapse, and yet that is precisely the fear within China. So, extraordinary momentum towards dealing with environmental issues, including through innovation, including in particular renewable energy, but starting from deep and I would say persistent problems. These are not problems, however much momentum there is, that will be dealt with within the next generation. Okay. So this is the question we all want to know the answer to, right? Will China rule the world? And I'm going to add, will China save the world? That's perhaps what we're interested in. It's the question on everyone's lips. To this, though, of course, I want to do the classic social science thing of questioning the question. So I want to ask, which China do we mean when we ask this question? I want to say, rule in what way? How rule? And of course, how save the world? And which world are we talking about even? And rule or save what or whom? I'm going to have a go at answering some of these questions. And what I want to suggest is that if we especially take these questions of rule and save, then in today's world of technology and innovation is an extremely important and insightful lens to be looking at these questions. The first thing we can say is that because the Chinese government themselves are aware of the importance of innovation in the world, this leads to a particular industrial policy of innovation which is techno-nationalist. It is about applying or exceeding the growth of Chinese power in the world through innovation and importantly, at the moment, which is an intersection, I would say, of an essentially contested historical conjuncture which has happened over the last 300 or 400 years. There's an excellent book on this by Hung Ho Fang, between China on the one hand and global capitalism. These things have been converging painfully over several centuries. Are we now perhaps at the climax of that convergence? But there is another added to all of this, which is that innovation at the moment all over the world is grappling with the challenges of managing or governing complexity. And this is a particular challenge, I would say, when we get to China. So there are many narratives. If you find out, you were going to look up what is happening in China regarding innovation, you will see essentially contested debates. There are optimists who say that China is running away with technology, and within a few years' time, Apple and Silicon Valley will be left in the dust. Then you have the very opposite agenda. You have pessimists who say there are essential structural problems behind the form of innovation in China, and it is simply irreparable. The best that they can do is build a house of cards. To that, though, there is a response, which is the so-called disruptive dialogue, which is that there are many companies in China which are, in fact, not part of what the party state officially supports, and yet they are flourishing in the interstices of the problems that the Chinese party state creates. To this, I want to add one final thing, which is that these disruptors are usually described purely in techno-economic terms. But what is going on right now in China is that they are grown to a point in which they are becoming a political issue and a political constituency. So just let me give you an example of this. On the supply side, usually innovation focuses on the supply side. On the one hand, we have the narrative of what this party state is achieving. Now, I want to stress that all four of these quadrants are true, right? They are true simultaneously. And that is part of the difficulty of understanding innovation in China. There is increasingly globally significant state investment and support for innovation at simply unrivaled scale and pace. Unrivaled. There is nowhere else in the world which is achieving what China is achieving in these ways. So we have enormous wind farms. The growth of wind power in China is simply spectacular. There's no other word for it. Similarly, solar power, while solar PV is still relatively small in the domestic market, Forbes can quite rightly describe the industry as totally and utterly dominated by China. The same thing there's at least a certain amount of hype about electric vehicles as well in China. It is the biggest market in the world. And also about various kinds of eco-city initiatives, perhaps at city level. This is, of course, not a real picture. To this, though, the pessimist, which you will see a lot of in American literature in particular, right, is that you really do actually also see this. The party state means there is extraordinary misallocation of funding. There is hamstrung central planning. There is division across regions, which means there is no coordination. There is simply lots of local state corporatism and waste, even corruption. And so we see the likes of this. We see an eco-city which is anything but eco, even inhabited. It is just a ghost town. We see a wonderful array of publicly provided electric vehicle chargers, which have not a single car charging and are probably dusty and out of use. So this is also the reality. To this, though, there is the response that within those problems create opportunities that have been responded to not by the official supported state-owned enterprises, but by the market, by disruptive innovators. And these are genuinely disruptive innovators. They are not like Uber, who are simply providing platforms to mobilize other people's assets. So in the likes of Alibaba, in Tencent, across a range of industries, we see that China is undoubtedly developing a new form of innovation which is extraordinarily productive. And it is productive precisely because it flourishes amidst, it is like weeds growing out of the pavement. It is extraordinarily resilient, and it is extremely good at dealing with the complexity of the modern global market. But the final point of all of this is that in the likes of Alibaba and Tencent, these are sort of unspoken national champions, but they are also able to amass foreign capital, and they are growing beyond their original industries. So Alibaba is sort of the eBay of China. It is now so much more than the eBay of China. It is so much more than eBay. It is moving into a completely different space, and of course what's so fascinating in particular about all these companies is that green technology is something that they are particularly interested in. So they are pushing beyond the boundaries of their own industry, and they are pushing into completely new political spaces. Sorry, go down. There we go. So they are merging into new industry sectors, and together with ongoing systemic dysfunction, this is now politically pushing at the power relations within China and within global capitalism. The supply side is good, but the demand side is also matters. And the key point to all of this within innovation is the extraordinary importance of the Chinese middle class. But as you see, I have put that in scare quotes, quite deliberately, because what the middle class means in China is still in formation. It is still uncertain. It is certainly not what we in the West understand to be middle class. It is an ongoing project, and it is one that is unfolding absolutely in parallel with and in co-production with innovation. So, for instance, on the one, and you can trace exactly the same route. So on the one hand, we have the growth of the Chinese economy supported by the government, which creates good middle class jobs. But then on the other hand, you have that this creates extraordinary inequality, which has pressure on towards a middle class job. Then you have the emergent Chinese middle class as an entrepreneurial private sector class. But this is actually a very status quo and a politically apolitical group. And yet, at the same time, this is also a group that is now being celebrated by the party as the saviours of the nation, and which is growing bored of many of the complexity-related problems that the current regime imposes upon their lives. This is a very combustible. Again, all these four are true. The particular example that I've been looking at for the last few years is electric mobility, electric urban mobility. And what's so neat about this is that these four dialogues, these four discourses, map perfectly onto four different kinds of electric mobility, urban mobility innovation. The official story is that the electric car will overtake the Chinese electric car will overtake around the corner, right? It will, instead of bombing down the road with VW and Toyota, by taking a different technological trajectory, it will get on the inside of the bend, and by the end, we'll all be driving Chinese cars. This is not working, right? You will read all the time about how many EVs are being sold in China. I'm not saying they're exaggerated, but I'm saying they are minuscule, right? They are still a drop in the ocean. what is still going on is the massive growth of the actual car. That is the main story that is still unfolding in China. Yet there is an extraordinary disruptive story as well, which is never talked about, which is the electric two-wheeler. While electric cars have struggled to sell 100,000, there are 200 million of these vehicles on China's roads. Right? This is a genuinely low-carbon disruptive innovation. It is getting no press whatsoever, and in fact is even knocked off the road by the government themselves because it's a security threat. These are small vehicles, they knock people over. But adding, to finish off the story, is the emerging discourse of mobility as a service. And what is so interesting about that is that this, again, is populated by Chinese disruptive innovation companies. The Chinese version of Uber, which is much more than Uber. Tencent are in this space, in collaboration with German car companies. So too for Alibaba, Baidu. They are in extraordinary competition. They want a new mode of moving around cities. So in the past, with colleagues on this project, we've put together 4 possible scenarios, which I won't talk through in any depth whatsoever. I just want to show to you that there are, while this dynamic that I've been discussing is there, it leads to potentially very varied future scenarios, all of which are plausible. And you can see in this particular case that the decarbonisation of mobility might go from being very low to being really quite high. Similarly, the global leadership of innovation in China might be really quite obvious and marked, or it might be more contested. This is not yet a done deal. This is an ongoing political process. But the overview of these scenarios, though, is that all of them involve significant social and systemic. They all involve the shaping of dominance by the middle class, which could range from as little as 10%. That could be the middle class. It could be 10% of China. Or it could be as much as 40%. This is an extraordinary difference, a big range in possibilities. They will all involve digitisation, profound digitisation, perhaps in different forms, and urbanisation and city governance will be an incredibly important part of that, in continuing if not devolution, then strength of Chinese megacities within the Chinese polity. What none of them, therefore, foresee is the simple replacement of the car by the electric car. In other words, none of them see the success of the official narrative as it is. None of them see the simple, unchallenged, unrivaled asset of Chinese innovation in the world. And none of them will resolve all the contemporary social and political and environmental issues that are associated with these problems. So just to finish off then, I've said that innovation environment is a particularly interesting and insightful lens, perhaps in some respects because it is not what we tend to look at. It is not the very high stakes. Zhongnanhai is China's Kremlin. It is trying to read what is going on in the centre of government. Right? A dark art, as it were. This is not something that certainly I have any access to. But I do believe that looking at what's going on in innovation actually tells us a lot about the evolution of Chinese society. So for which China, I would say a surprising China, a middle-class China, a complexity adept and megacity-based China. This is a China that is embryonic, but is still unfolding. It is not yet dominant. Secondly, which world? Well, we tend to think the sheer incompatibility of China dominating the world is because we are thinking of a world that is dominated by American neoliberalism. For me, the Trumpism and Brexit can be read in many ways as the swan song of that world order. It is the implosion and the self-destruction of that world order. So what happens instead? That is an open question, and it is one which China will strongly condition. Then rule and save how or what? The most important point of all of this is this essentially contested. It will be essentially contested domestically, within China, and globally, at every step. This is not there is not a prospect, as far as I can see, towards some great striding into a green and pleasant and unturbulent future. No, it will be it will still be turbulent, but it will be thereby highly productive. And that is the genius, for instance, of these disruptive innovators, is that they feed off the contestation. So this is towards a still highly non-linear process of innovation, but towards a clean text, what I would call a complexity bourgeois, a new form of middle class, which is hegemonic on the world, specifically around its domination of innovation. And what it saves, well, what it saves is global capitalism. So this is perhaps the greatest irony of our lives, the greatest irony of our day, is that the Chinese Communist Party are going to save global capitalism. And just as I mentioned earlier that China's environmental problems are the world's, well, so too will China's environmental solutions be the world's. And that, of course, will earn it, maybe not undying, but extraordinary global prestige and acceptance for that very hegemony. But I have to end, of course, on a note of caution, which is that all of this comes with new systemic blindnesses, new systemic exclusions, new tensions, and, as I mentioned, this essential turbulence. So domestically, perhaps the most obvious one, is that I do not foresee that the existing disparity between system winners and losers will go down. To the contrary, I think that it will become legitimated, not mitigated. It will simply be that the winners are the legitimate winners because they have saved the world from climate change. On the other hand, globally, there will be continual tension because while Chinese technological and economic catch-up will be unquestionable, its political and cultural catch-up will continue to frustrate it because it will not continue at the same pace. And that will lead to enormous tension on all sides because it will remain unfamiliar to the West and it will remain frustratingly slow to China. So, thank you very much.